Thank you for clicking on this video. Today, I'm going to talk to a good friend of mine about Godzilla in general, but also about the new movie Godzilla Minus One. And I actually just saw it. I just got out of theaters maybe 5 minutes ago. Very fresh on my mind. My friend, his name is Dr. John Blaylock. He's a medical doctor. He's a very good medical doctor. Very knowledgeable about history, a huge Godzilla fan, very knowledgeable about many topics. But yeah, we will be discussing the movie. I will say he's a super fan, a Godzilla super fan, much more than I am. I think he just has more hours in the game than I do, more experience. But look, we're going to start with his hot takes. So I'm going to give my hot take, and then I'd love to hear your hot take, Doctor. So yeah, I just walked out of it, and I've seen a lot of movies this year. This one or another movie will be my top movie of the year I've seen so far, for sure. So I really enjoyed it. You know, you said something to me many times that you described to me what the perfect Godzilla movie was. Some of the elements you had to have, and some of them are obvious, even to someone who's not that familiar with Godzilla. It's like, oh, you got to have great monster action, right? Obviously. But then you would mention how the drama of the human story has got to be really good. And I got to say, this is the first time I've seen a Godzilla movie where I was completely gripped by the human story. And so much so that, like, I think even non-Godzilla fans would like this movie. Like, to them, it would just be a good human drama movie that happens to have a giant monster in it as one of the elements. Because that's how powerful the dramatic storyline is. So this is, like I said, you mentioned a lot. So about how important the human element is. And I got to say, like, the American versions of Godzilla that I've seen, they don't do a good job with the drama. They do try, but not as good as this one. So I did cry. I am getting middle-aged, and I think that affects crying. You know, like, I've seen a lot of older men cry a lot. And I'm looking forward to it because I like a good cry. I did cry once during the movie because I was just that invested in the story, and they did a good job with the emotional elements of it. And then the Godzilla elements, like, they were just perfect. There were so many shots of Godzilla in different situations where I was like, wow, this is what I want to see in a giant monster movie, specifically Godzilla. So there's scenes of Godzilla in the ocean, chasing ships of different sizes. There's Godzilla in the countryside. There's Godzilla at night, daytime, and there's the destruction of buildings. So that Godzilla stuff was done so well. It looked great, and it was directed well, and Godzilla was very believable as a monster, and it was very scary, very shocking, the amount of carnage he produced. And I'm kind of sad they're not showing it in, like, an IMAX screen or something. But I got the impression of how the scale, anyway, just on a regular movie screen, it is done very well. The music is really good. Like, they use the classic themes of Godzilla very well. They use them appropriately. But there's a lot of what I'm guessing is original music. A lot of it's really haunting. It doesn't play during the monster scenes. It plays during the dramatic scenes. And it's very memorable. It's a great soundtrack. The other thing is the plot is easy to follow. Like, I got to say, maybe because it gets lost in translation, but there's been some Japanese Godzilla movies. I'll even say, I think, what was Shin Godzilla? Even Shin Godzilla, I have to watch it. I honestly have to watch it a few more times to totally understand the plot. I still don't understand it completely. And I think a lot of it is because it's Japanese culture stuff that I'm just not going to get. But this movie, I totally understood the plot. Like, I was never confused. And I think maybe it was the writer, because it is a very Japanese movie. And I feel like I learned a lot about Japanese culture and mentality, post-war mentality. But I think the director, he gives you enough context clues so you don't have to be Japanese to understand why people are acting a certain way. Plot was very clear for me to follow. I can't find any flaws with this movie. It was very enjoyable. But that's my hot take. So let's hear yours.
Yeah. So first, just to give a little background, what does it mean to be a Godzilla super fan? For me, this is the 37th Godzilla film ever made, 33rd that Toho has made. I've seen them all multiple times, every single one of them, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So that's the kind of fan that I am. Just to give you an idea, I understand the full breadth of the franchise. Yeah, the old joke of Godzilla fans is like you say, "Oh, my name is so and so, and I have watched X amount of Godzilla," or my favorite era of Godzilla is this or that or the other. And the reason we do that is, again, it's not an ego trip of like who's seen more Godzilla movies. Is that this franchise is so old, like this Godzilla minus one represents the 70th anniversary of Godzilla. And I mean, this is such a storied franchise that Godzilla means different things to different people and different fans. And that's part of the beauty of the series. And Godzilla fans respect each other as to like, do you like the 1970s Godzilla movies? Do you like the 90s? Do you like the 2000s? That shapes things. So that's how we often introduce each other. So that's why I introduce myself that way, so people can understand my context. It's not about an ego thing of like, oh, I'm the super fan of super fan, just so people understand what is my knowledge of this franchise. And that largely shapes how I view every Godzilla movie.
That makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. But you have a full picture. I just want to say also, I talk about UFOs on this channel, and me and the good doctor here, we talk about UFOs a lot. It's interesting that from what we hear from insiders, if it's to be believed, and what we know from written documents, the Godzilla franchise is about as old as the United States study of UFOs officially, which I think is an interesting parallel, because there's also an interesting parallel between the use of nuclear weapons and the appearance of UFOs. And Godzilla, of course, is created or has a strong connection to nuclear weapons. I just want to point that out. I thought that was interesting. I'll say right now, I've only seen a handful. I've seen the original Godzilla in black and white. I've seen the modern Godzilla movies, starting with Gareth Edwards' Godzilla and all the sequels that came after that. And I've seen a few movies with you, but just once. Some of your favorite movies with Rodan, I remember, that you replayed. So that's it, really. That's where I'm coming from.
Absolutely. I just point one thing out. UFOs are very prevalent in the Godzilla series. They're used in a lot of movies. There's a lot of movies that have aliens, UFOs involving Godzilla. So for those of you who are in the UFO community but may not know much about Godzilla, there's a lot of movies out there for you where Godzilla interacts with UFOs frequently, often.
Interesting. I hadn't even thought about that. That's great. But that is true. I'm now remembering that, yeah, like some of his biggest foes are extraterrestrial in origin.
Yes, absolutely. Right. And all that being said, so Godzilla minus one. So my hot take is when I left this theater, I could already say that this was one of the greatest Godzilla movies ever made. Hands down. Easy to say. And for what you had mentioned, what makes a great Godzilla movie? So yes, you have to have good monster action. You're not required to have another monster. Like, people who are not as hardcore Godzilla fans feel like, oh, you have to have Godzilla fight another monster. But some of the greatest Godzilla movies don't. In fact, the top three that a lot of people think of, if you include this one, Godzilla minus one, Shin Godzilla, and the original 1954, don't have other monsters. It's just Godzilla, because that's all you need sometimes. But right. whether you do or whether you don't have another monster, you got to have good monster action. You got to have a reason for them to be there and a compelling reason for them to be interacting with the main characters. But yes, where a lot of kaiju movies, not just Godzilla movies as a whole, but kaiju movies fall through, is that they have a weak human cast and they have a weak human story. And that's the old joke of the really bad Godzilla movies or bad kaiju movies, where people are like, oh, get the humans out of the way. I just want to see the kaiju fight. And whenever you hear people say that, this is not a good movie. Because the human narrative should be so strong and so good that, ironically, you could take Godzilla out of the movie and it would by itself be a good movie. If you just replace Godzilla with a natural disaster, hurricane, tornado, you name it.
Right, exactly.
And that is very apparent in this movie. Very apparent. The characters, the human characters coming out of World War II. This movie is set in 1946, a year after Japan's surrender and defeat in World War II. So obviously a very low point culturally for Japan. They've been nuked twice, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. their country is destroyed, and now they're trying to rebuild, and here comes Godzilla. And I'll leave it at that because I don't want to spoil anything, in this section. And that's stuff you can get from the trailers. But that's the basis of it. The human characters are very compelling. They're very well fleshed out. And for me, consuming all the Godzilla movies I have, in the really bad Godzilla movies, when the human characters are in peril with Godzilla or other monsters, you don't honestly care if they live or die. You're like, maybe they'll get crushed, maybe they won't. I don't really care. Watching this movie, when they were in danger, I didn't want them to die. And for those who may not have watched as many Godzilla movies, the Godzilla is known for the main characters not always having thick plot armor. There are main characters that die in Godzilla movies. So there is this real danger, watching this movie of like, are they going to live? Are they going to die? And again, no spoilers. I'm not going to say whether anyone does or doesn't, but just to add that level of anticipation, if you see this movie, that is a real danger. Like, Toho is not afraid to kill off main characters in Godzilla movies. So that is a legitimate fear when I was watching this, seeing that.
And I was just going to say, yeah, that's a really good point. And part of that, I think, is because the story is Godzilla. So it's not a human character. The franchise is Godzilla. All the main characters that are introduced, which is not too many, they're all fleshed out. I love the scientist character. I love his hair. They use his hair a lot during certain scenes with the wind, and he's just a great character. You being a doctor, me being a ball, we're both scientists. There's a great scientist character. But yeah, all these characters, I never knew if they were going to die. I really didn't.
Now, we talk about what makes a good Godzilla movie. A great Godzilla movie is usually that human element. But what makes a great Godzilla movie a masterpiece is when you layer the monster and the human action to talk about a social narrative. Because that's really the roots of Godzilla. The very first Godzilla movie was in 1954, Japan trying to reckon with itself that it had lost World War II, been devastated by nuclear weapons. And at that stage, 9 years after defeat of World War II, they were not super happy with their government. They weren't super happy with where their culture was going. And they had a lot of reckoning to deal with in the end. And Godzilla was a means by which they could deal with that as a society. And all the best Godzilla movies go back to that, but they modernize it. Shin Godzilla, the last Toho made Godzilla movie in 2016, was a very heavy social narrative on the tsunami and the Fukushima nuclear reactor meltdown that happened and was completely bungled by the Japanese government. And that's what that movie is about, using Godzilla as a metaphor to talk about how the Japanese government really screwed that up, because that was a huge cultural event for Japan. And again, without not giving away too many details of this movie, what I will say this movie addresses in immense detail is, one, it deals with a lot of the issues from the pandemic. A lot of issues with the pandemic, in the sense of how the Japanese government handled the pandemic, which, for those who don't know, they didn't handle it well. Far worse than America. The Japanese people were not given a lot of support by their government. And that plays out here. And you superimpose that over post-war Japan, where the government has been shattered. They just lost a war. They're having to write a new constitution, completely reform their government. So similarly, their government is not in great shape to help them after the war, let alone to help them when Godzilla shows up. And that's, for those who don't know, that's where the name of the movie comes from, is this idea that in 1946, Japan's economy was at zero. So if your economy is at zero, then Godzilla attacks you, now you're at -1. You're in a negative state. So that's where the name comes from. And that was very apparent to me about halfway through the film. There's some very strong narratives that talk about that, the people trying to band together, the government not helping. And that's very apparent to what was happening historically at that time. It was a very big deal. They also talk about another huge thing, which is not unique to Japan, but just post-war in general, which is, how do you deal with survivor's guilt if you survive the war? And it doesn't mean that you survived the war in the sense that you're in the military. You could have been a civilian who survived the fire bombings of Tokyo, as an example. There's a lot of survivor's guilt going on. And a lot of people experiencing PTSD when PTSD didn't exist as a diagnosis. Doesn't mean people didn't experience it. They did, but no one knew what it was at the time. So how do you deal with that? So all that social commentary was layered on itself. And the thing that was very poignant to me, and I will also disclose, I've seen this movie twice. I saw it last night in regular screenings, and I saw it earlier today a second time in IMAX. I highly recommend it in IMAX. Highly recommend. But what I will say is in our time where we have the war in Ukraine going on, we have the war between Israel and Hamas going on right now. When you look at these characters in post-war Japan and their struggles, like they are very much so mirroring what Ukrainian soldiers, Russian soldiers, especially if they're fighting against their will, Ukrainian civilians are experiencing. And same thing with Israeli citizens, Palestinian citizens, soldiers on both sides, what they are experiencing. And I think that's just very poignant. And that's the best form of Godzilla, is when it's a social commentary on what's occurring now. And this could not have come at a better time to hit on those things. And that, to me, is what elevates it to that masterpiece level. Godzilla looks beautiful, absolutely beautiful. This is only the second time that Toho has done a fully digitized Godzilla, meaning no man in a suit. The first time that they devoted themselves to that was with Shin Godzilla. And that was a big deal for Shin Godzilla because they'd always had a guy in a suit at some point.
Yeah.
And these are the first two movies where they did it. But what will amaze you, if you didn't know this already, this will amaze you, is that as beautiful as those visual effects were, the budget was $15 million.
$15 million.
It cost less money to make than it did the last Halloween movie.
Oh my God.
Look at those visuals, man. Godzilla was freaking beautiful.
Yeah.
Freaking beautiful in so many of these scenes. Like I couldn't believe it when I heard the budget. I was like, they got to be lying. But here's why I think, and I'm not a big behind the scenes movie guy. Like I don't know a lot about the movie industry, but I read a lot about this because I was fascinated by this. Like, how did they make Godzilla look so beautiful on such a small budget? And I think the answer is time. They worked on this movie special effects wise for 2.5 years.
Okay.
So I think while they had a small budget, they had a lot of time to really squeeze it out. And by comparison, if you read in the movie industry right now, especially for the big budget films like Marvel, DC, Disney, what they're running into is they have a ton of money, but they don't have a ton of time. So they're like, here's a $200 million budget, but you got 6 months to get it done.
Yeah.
So that's what boggled my mind, is I was like, how does this Godzilla on a $15 million budget look as good as Godzilla did in Kong versus Godzilla, which had over a $200 million budget?
Yeah.
Well, the answer is time. They spent a lot of time on this. And take note, Marvel, take note, DC, take note, Disney, because when Japan can, on $15 million, make a better movie than y'all have made recently in the Marvels, Flash, Wish, you name it, that does not speak well for Hollywood right now. Like Toho is leading the way.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's almost like that triangle is not always true. You know that triangle where, like, look, if you want a quality product, you have 3 categories, right? One of them is like, it's cheap, it's done quickly, and it's good. Is that what the triangle is?
Yeah. So it's like if you could have any of these 3, but you only have 2 out of the 3. Is what you have to choose. So what they chose is they said, we want it done cheaply and well, but we're going to sacrifice time. But they took their time with it. Right. So that's when they got it done.
And it seems like for movies, at least, like Marvel, DC, like you said, modern American movies, blockbuster movies, it's almost not true. You cannot just get speed and quality.
Yeah.
And pay money. Like the money's that it's not enough. Maybe we've hit a limit, but that triangle does not seem to work with movies as far as special effects budgets.
Yeah.
You can't have the speed and a quick turnaround, even if you have a lot of money, because I guess people just hit a limit, I guess, with how fast they can draw or move their mouse or whatever they're doing.
Exactly. Yeah. We talk about crunch with video games. I guess you can have crunch with the movie industry with special effects, except there you're on a very hard deadline of when you got to get it done. And,
Absolutely.
hats off, anyone listening, if you happen to work in the visual effects industry and the movies, hats off to you, because I know that is a very hard job, very, very tough job. But we're thankful for all of you for giving us these great movies. And that's something I want to hark on as well, that the way that this movie, again, comes together as this masterpiece. When you look at the Monsterverse, the American Godzilla movies, in my view, the only movie that can even remotely compare to Godzilla Minus One is going to be the Gareth Edwards 2014 Godzilla. Okay. Even if you compare them, like, again, the Monsterverse Godzillas, they lack that social commentary. They're like, oh, you got the Titans, and they're supposed to be about bringing balance. But when you really dig into it, it's like the Titans, they're just kind of doing their own thing. Right? Like humanity's just kind of along for the ride, if you will.
Sure.
So it's like, it lacks that social commentary. Like you could try to be like, oh, it's about climate change, but it's like, but the humans are really a non-factor. Like they're just along for the ride for these things. Whereas in Godzilla Minus One, the humans are not a non-factor. Like they're very much so involved in the story and what's going on. And it's very much so a reflection back on us.
I want to go back to that Gareth Evans movie, because that is the most like a good Japanese Godzilla movie. And here's the thing, when I watch the movie and I see the actors, you see their faces and you see them emoting, and you could tell they're emoting, but it's missing something that this movie has,
Yeah.
Because in this movie, you just so much more invest. So it's like Gareth, I'll give him credit, he was trying and he knew what the elements were, but it just wasn't pulled. That aspect was not pulled off as well. I love the Mutos. I love Godzilla in that movie. The special effects are great. It's visually striking. The soundtrack's good. And he's got the elements for the human drama, but maybe it's the actors. I don't know what it is, but he couldn't quite get it there with the human element.
Exactly. And what's funny about this, I had kept myself on a media blackout because I wanted to go into this movie stone cold. That's how I prefer taking my Godzilla movies. I don't want to be biased by anything. So one of the things I read is that, so the movie obviously just came out in America, December 1st. It came out in November in Japan and was a huge hit in Japan, massive hit. But it debuted for the first time to the public at the Tokyo Film Festival in October. And Gareth Edwards actually went and watched it. And then he did a joint interview with the director of Godzilla Minus One.
Okay.
And I'm glad I did not hear this beforehand, because it would have biased my opinion heavily going into this film. But for those of you who don't mind, obviously you're listening to this review for a reason. Gareth Edwards said that he was jealous of this movie because this is how a Godzilla movie is supposed to be. That is a direct quote. And then he immediately followed that by saying, this has got to be one of the best Godzilla movies ever. And keep in mind, he directed the Godzilla movie. And he's saying this about Godzilla Minus One. Like, how high of a compliment can you be?
And now that I think about it, I was thinking about this while I was watching a movie. I think you have to somehow fundamentally change Godzilla for the American audience to fit an American trauma.
Yeah.
Because that's probably one of the elements that's missing. Godzilla, like you said, is a way of dealing with a trauma for a culture. I mean, that's a Japanese trauma that they're healing from or still processing. And it didn't happen to us. I mean, we were involved, but it didn't happen to us. We have had our own traumas. So I just feel like, we need to change the focus of the trauma, because that's one of the elements that's missing with the American Godzilla movies.
Exactly. And a little bit more background also on this one is that Toho has been waiting to release a movie like this because they were under contract with Legendary Pictures. That Legendary Pictures basically had till 2020 or 2021 when Kong vs. Godzilla was released, that Toho would not release any live action Godzilla movies after Shin Godzilla. So they've been waiting to do this. And one thing they've stated is that they want to restart a Godzilla cinematic universe. Yeah, exactly. For those who are not familiar, Godzilla was the original cinematic universe, long before Marvel. They did this back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So Toho has experience with this, both the good and the bad, when it comes to that.
So now, let me ask you this. This is funny. So people are getting tired of the multiverse now, but it's really big. And ironically, I think there might actually be a multiverse, like for real, which is ironic that people are bored with it. And I'm like, I don't know. What if it's real? Anyway, so let me ask you this. Did Godzilla do the multiverse first as well? So it did the interconnected cinematic universe. But are there multiverse storylines in the 70 years of Godzilla?
I mean, technically, not in the sense of interconnectivity of the multiverse. Like, we're not talking like Doctor Strange and the multiverse of madness kind of stuff. There are different versions of Godzilla, different histories. Yes, it's like the Showa era, which is the original 50s through the 70s. That is one cinematic universe, which is insane when you think about it back then. The Heisei series from the 80s to the 90s, it's its own separate universe, its own separate telling of Godzilla. The Millennial series the same way. And up until Shin Godzilla, the focal point that connected all these multiverses, if you will, even though they didn't directly interact with each other, was the original 1954 Gojira. Shin Godzilla, and by extension now Godzilla Minus One, were the first live-action Godzilla movies to ignore the original and say, we're doing our own. One thing I'm very happy you mentioned, because I don't know if a lot of people would pick up on this, is the score of this movie. The score of this movie, the music of this movie is so good. It does harken back to some classic Godzilla themes. And yes, it does have a lot of new stuff as well, a lot of new scores. I will point something out again. I don't want to spoil when this specific score happens, but for those hardcore Godzilla fans out there who might listen to this review, they actually use the main title from the original Godzilla versus Mothra. They modify it slightly, but that is in there, and it surprised me, mostly because when you listen to that score, the first half of it is just Godzilla's theme song that everyone knows and loves. If you've seen any Godzilla movie, you've heard it. But it transitions into Mothra's theme song at the end. And there's a particular scene, one of Godzilla's attacks, where they use that. And I was so shocked when I first watched it and listened to it. I was like, where is this going? Why are they doing this? And I'm not going to spoil, like, is Mothra in this movie? Is Mothra not in this movie? Or anything like that. And I will say they very poignantly use this theme in perfect sync with what happens in that scene. So for those hardcore fans who know this song, when you see it. For those who are interested, you can just Google Godzilla Mothra theme song, listen to it, and wait for it in the movie. But that shocked me because I did not expect to hear that theme. I expected to hear Godzilla's theme, but not Godzilla Mothra's theme.
We're probably going to end up talking a lot about Japanese culture. Like I said, I feel like I learned stuff about Japanese culture. And I wonder if, so this movie had the same director, writer, and visual effects artist, right? And I wonder if the reason why this Godzilla movie and other Godzilla movies are so good, I wonder if it's part of the Japanese work culture. I feel like you would know more than me, or you could confirm if this is true, but I feel like what I've just heard about Japanese work culture is that it's almost an experiment in pushing the limits of human productivity, far beyond what's comfortable, to me at least, as an American. So I just wonder if part of the reason why this movie is so good is because of the Japanese culture, which has influenced the director, writer, and visual effects artists. What are your thoughts on that?
I bet it did. I mean, in the sense that you got to keep in mind the script and a lot of this stuff was done during the pandemic. So during very stressful times, they still persevered to get this movie produced and get this movie filmed and done, and especially the visual effects, which the vast majority was done during lockdown. So long hours, putting the nose to the grinder, but obviously a love letter to Godzilla, that they really wanted to make this right. They really wanted to put all those efforts in. And I agree. I think it is not just a combination of just hard work ethic. I think it is also a combination of hard work ethic with passion. Because you can pay people to work really hard or work long hours, but there's an old military phrase, you can pay a soldier to fight, you can pay a soldier to storm a hill, but you can't pay a soldier to believe. And watching this film, I really think everyone who worked on it, starting with writer, director, special effects, they really believed in this. They really believed in Godzilla and believed in sending this message about Japanese culture. And what I will also say to that is, with the idea of Toho wanting to start another cinematic universe, is that they wanted Godzilla to be more accessible. to the wider audience, to the world. And that was the one criticism I had of Shin Godzilla, which you mentioned earlier, is that Shin Godzilla easily one of the greatest Godzilla movies ever made, if not the greatest. But the one downside to it is it's very hard for me to recommend it to other people unless they know a lot about Japanese culture. Because if you don't know a lot about Japanese culture, that movie is going to fall flat on its face because it's just not going to make sense. It's not going to make any sense. But Godzilla Minus One is not like that. It hits these very broad themes that, again, even if you were not Japanese and you don't understand Japanese post-war culture, even if you understand just post-war culture in general, like American soldiers who went through hell in World War II and came back with PTSD, came back struggling with their lives, you can relate to the characters in this movie. Even if you've never been to war, if you struggle from mental illness and you struggle with how do you go on every day, you can relate to these people. Even if you haven't struggled with mental illness or been to war, but you have a family member or friend who has, and you've had to comfort them, you can relate to people in this movie. If you have felt abandoned by your larger culture or government in a time of need, and you survived because you were able to rely on the community rather than the larger social structure to get through, you can relate to this movie. And again, I think this movie relates very strongly and heavily with the pandemic of saying, sure, you soldier through and get through, but you don't get through it alone, even in isolation of the pandemic. Like, we still had to band together and help each other. And I think that's a strong message. And I think that's largely why this movie is being so well received, is that they hit the nail on the head to say, we're hitting a specific Japanese post-war trauma, talking about the pandemic as well. But these are not uniquely Japanese things, even though within Japanese lens, that's how they're going to look at it. Anyone who's experienced these things or has known someone who's experienced these things can relate to it.
That's a great point. And I want to mention something, a little anecdote. So first of all, I was happy. I went to the theater and it was pretty full of people. And a lot of guys just like me, middle-aged guys. I was like, I'm in my zone. These are my people. But I want to say, if you're a middle-aged person or whoever you are, you're interested in watching Godzilla, I actually think you could take your mom to it. And I think your mom would like it. I say that because I think my mom would like it. So during that Thanksgiving break, my mom started watching the Joker movie because I told her it was a good movie. For honestly, a lot of the same reasons why Godzilla Minus One is a good movie. It deals with society, with being neglected by society, and it deals with real issues and sadness that people can relate to. The Joker movie with Joaquin Phoenix. Now, my mom started watching it, and she was really into it until a certain point. I forget. I think it's when the Joker kills his mom. Oh, spoilers for the Joker. So she was okay up to that point, and she told me why she lost it. She's like, look, I liked it before then because it was just a sad movie, and I like that. But then it got too crazy off the rails, okay? So why I'm talking about this is because I think my mom would like Godzilla Minus One because it never goes off the rails that way. Like, it is very sad. I cried, and it's sadness is a big theme, but it's also funny though. It's got lighthearted moments, but I think my mom would enjoy this movie all the way through. It's got a satisfying ending, I'll say. It's got an ending your mom will like. We'll talk about it more later, but I just want to say that it's very accessible, so much so that your mom would probably like it, whoever's listening right now.
It's a very accessible film, and unlike a lot of really long franchises, if you've never seen a Godzilla movie, you can plug and play with this movie. You don't even have to have seen a single Godzilla movie, and you can enjoy this film, which is a blessing to say in the modern cinematic era. That's for sure.
Right. Great. Okay, well, do you want to switch over to spoilers?
Yes.